You're just a coward with a joystick who doesn't know what real war looks like. Clear my path to the LZ, and I'll marry you when I get home. Don't you dare disconnect!
In the air-conditioned silence of a Nevada bunker, Kayden Solis fights a war that smells of ozone and static, miles away from the heat of the sun. To the real soldiers, he is a ghost in the machine, a man who sees the world through a lens and kills with a click, never tasting the dust or the blood of the front lines. Commander Elena Thorne is the living embodiment of the grit he lacks, a woman forged in the fire of direct engagement, who views Kayden as a pampered technician. She believes that true courage requires a heartbeat in the dirt, and she has no room in her world for a man who plays video games while her friends bleed out in the sand. But as the shadows lengthen over a hostile valley and the sound of enemy boots grows closer, the distance between the desert of the Middle East and the screens of Nevada begins to dissolve. A single line of communication becomes a lifeline, and a man's willingness to lose everything for a woman who despised him will prove that bravery isn't measured by where you stand, but by what you are willing to let go of. The fluorescent lights of the Creech Air Force Base briefing room hummed with a clinical, soul-sucking persistence that made Kayden Solis's head ache. He sat at the back of the room, his flight suit crisp, but his posture relaxed, a stark contrast to the rigid infantry officers surrounding him. He was checking his watch, thinking about the latency of the satellite uplink, when the heavy oak doors swung open. Commander Elena Thorne marched in, her boots clicking like a metronome against a tile, the smell of gunpowder and adrenaline seemingly clinging to her camouflage uniform. She didn't look at the charts or the maps. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed directly on Kayden, narrowing with an intensity that could melt steel. The room fell silent as Elena bypassed the commanding officer and stopped inches from Kayden's chair, her shadow looming over his console. "So, you're the one assigned to my overwatch for the extraction mission," she said, her voice a low, dangerous rasp that carried through the quiet room. Kayden stood up slowly, offering a polite professional nod, but he didn't flinch. "Lieutenant Kayden Solis, ma'am. I'll be your eyes in the sky for the duration of the push into the valley." He tried to keep his tone neutral, but he could see the muscles in her jaw tightening as she looked at his clean, unscarred hands. Elena let out a short, mocking laugh that drew several looks from the senior staff. "Eyes in the sky? You mean a kid with a joystick sitting in a padded chair, while my people take real bullets in the chest." She leaned in closer, the scent of desert dust and peppermint gum hitting him as she lowered her voice for his ears only. "I've seen your type before, Solis. You think war is a series of pixels on a screen, a high-score game where you can just hit reset if things get too loud." Kayden felt the sting of the insult, but he kept his gaze steady, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a defensive retort. "I ensure your team makes it home, Commander," Kayden replied, his voice remaining remarkably calm despite the heat rising in his chest. "I see threats from 5 miles up that your scouts would miss until it was too late." Elena didn't seem impressed. If anything, his composure seemed to irritate her further. She reached out and tapped the pilot wings on his chest with a disparaging finger. "You're a coward with a joystick, playing God from 3,000 miles away in an air-conditioned box. Don't talk to me about threats when you've never felt the ground shake from an RPG." The other officers began to murmur, the social hierarchy of the room shifting as the real soldier exerted her dominance over the technician. Kayden's superior officer, Colonel Vance, cleared his throat but didn't intervene, allowing the humiliation to hang in the air like thick smoke. Elena took a step back, her lip curling in a sneer that dismissed Kayden's entire career in a single look. "Just stay out of our way, gamer boy. If I lose a single man because you were too busy adjusting your headset, I'll personally fly to Nevada to show you what a real fight looks like." Kayden watched her turn on her heel and exit the room, her departure leaving a vacuum of tension behind. He sat back down, his fingers tracing the edge of his flight suit sleeve, feeling the invisible weight of the responsibility he held. He knew the statistics. He knew the lives he had saved from his padded chair. But the stigma of the remote operator was a wall he could never seem to climb. His colleagues offered him sympathetic but distant looks, the kind of pity reserved for a man who has been publicly stripped of his dignity. To them, he was a vital asset. To the front line, he was a ghost who didn't deserve a seat at the table. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over the jagged Nevada mountains, Kayden walked to the high-security trailer that served as his cockpit. The desert air was cooling, but the sting of Elena's words remained fresh, a nagging doubt that whispered in the back of his mind. He checked the pre-flight diagnostics of the Reaper drone, already circling over the Middle Eastern coordinates, the thermal camera feed showing a peaceful valley that he knew would soon turn into a slaughterhouse. He adjusted his headset, the static a familiar companion, and prepared himself for the hours of silent vigil ahead. He wasn't looking for glory. He was looking for the woman who hated him, making sure she survived her own arrogance. As the mission clock began to tick down, Kayden saw the first infrared signatures of Elena's team moving into the mouth of the canyon. They looked like tiny, glowing ants on his screen, vulnerable and small against the vast, dark terrain. He saw the heat plumes of hidden enemy positions high on the ridges, spots the ground team couldn't possibly see from their low-angle perspective. He reached for the radio to warn them, but his hand hovered over the button as he remembered her sneer. He was the ghost, the gamer, the coward in the air-conditioned box. Could he really protect a woman who didn't believe he belonged in the same war? The hum of the drone's cooling fans in the Nevada trailer felt like a low growl of anticipation as Kayden watched the thermal feed sharpen. On his screen, the rugged terrain of the Middle East was a world of black, white, and deceptive grays, where every shadow could be a rock or a rifleman. He saw Elena's squad move with tactical precision, entering the narrowest part of the canyon, the kill box, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon on their side of the world. Suddenly, the thermal sensors flared white as an IED detonated at the front of the convoy, followed immediately by a rain of mortar fire for the ridges above. Kayden's heart hammered against his ribs, his hands moving instinctively over the controls to stabilize the camera and lock on to the muzzle flashes. "Overlord, this is Guardian. You have multiple hostiles on the north and east ridges, 50 meters above your position," Kayden said, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos of the comms. He could hear the frantic breathing and the deafening cracks of gunfire on Elena's end, a stark contrast to the sterile silence of his Nevada pod. Elena's voice broke through the static, sharp and breathless as she shouted orders to her team. "I see them, Solace. Just keep the feed clear and don't lose the signal." Even in the middle of a life-and-death struggle, her tone carried a trace of the old defiance, though the arrogance was being rapidly replaced by the sheer necessity of survival. As the minutes ticked by, the situation on the ground deteriorated with terrifying speed, the enemy closing the distance under the cover of the jagged rocks. Kayden watched as a second explosion disabled their lead vehicle, pinning the squad against a sheer cliff face with no clear path of retreat. The environmental pressure was suffocating. The heat of the desert was visible in the shimmering air of the thermal feed, a ghost of a sensation that Kayden felt in his own bones. He maneuvered the drone lower, pushing the airframe to its limits to get a better angle for his Hellfire missiles, but the clouds were beginning to roll in, threatening his line of sight. "Guardian, we're pinned. They're flanking us from the south. Where is our air support?" Elena screamed into her radio, the sound of a heavy machine gun drowning out her words for a moment. Kayden's screen showed 3 heat signatures crawling through a dry riverbed, positioned to get a direct line of fire on her exposed flank. "Working on it, Commander. I'm painting the targets now," Kayden replied, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with a speed that surpassed any video game he had ever played. He felt a bead of sweat bowl down his temple, the weight of the lives on his screen pressing down on him like a physical force. The gamer was now the only thing standing between the squad and a massacre, his bird's-eye view providing the only map of the unfolding disaster. He saw Elena dive behind a crumbling stone wall, her rifle jammed or out of ammo as she reached for her sidearm with trembling hands. The social distance between them, the gap between the soldier in the mud and the pilot in the sky, was vanishing, replaced by a raw digital intimacy. Kane could see her chest heaving through the thermal lens, a pulsing white rhythm of a human being pushed to the absolute brink of endurance.
Solace, if you're going to do something, do it now, she cried out, her voice cracking as the enemy moved to within 30 yards of her position. Caden locked the first target, his thumb hovering over the fire button, but a warning light flashed red on his console, high-altitude wind shear. If he fired now, the missile could drift, hitting the very wall Elena was using for cover. He had to wait for a 3-second window of stability, 3 seconds that felt like an eternity when watching a woman get hunted in real time. He held his breath, counting the pulses of the wind sensor, his eyes never leaving the white glow of Elena's form.
The enemy reached the edge of the riverbed, raising their weapons to end the woman who had mocked Caden's courage only hours before. In that split second, the wind sensor turned green, and Caden depressed the trigger, the silent launch of the Hellfire miles away manifesting as a streak of light on his screen. The explosion was precise, a calculated strike that erased the threat in a bloom of fire and dust, leaving Elena slumped against the wall in shock. For a heartbeat, there was silence on the radio, nothing but the sound of the wind and the crackle of burning brush.
Guardian, targets neutralized. You have a 10-second window to move to the crevice on your left, Caden whispered, his voice trembling slightly from the adrenaline dump. He saw Elena look up, her head tilting toward the sky, as if she could actually see the invisible Guardian watching over her. She didn't say thank you, and she didn't apologize, but the way she scrambled toward the new cover showed she finally trusted the eyes in the sky. However, as Caden scanned the wider area, his blood ran cold. A much larger force was moving in from the valley floor, and his drone was running low on fuel.
The situation in the valley had turned from a tactical nightmare into a desperate fight for breath, as Elena's squad was whittled down to a handful of survivors. From his station in Nevada, Caden watched the thermal signatures of her teammates blink out one by one, leaving Elena alone in a shallow crevasse, her silhouette glowing a lonely, fragile white against the cold stone. The arrogance that had defined her in the briefing room was gone, replaced by the heavy, slumped shoulders of a woman who knew she was waiting for the end. Caden leaned into his microphone, his voice dropping to a soft, rhythmic tone, realizing that if he couldn't save her body yet, he had to save her mind from the encroaching darkness. "Commander, I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. Just breathe with me," he whispered, watching the erratic rise and fall of her chest on his monitor.
The environmental pressure shifted as a sandstorm began to whip through the canyon, obscuring Caden's visual feed with a grainy, static-filled haze. In the Middle East, Elena was coughing, the sound of sand hitting her helmet like a million tiny needles, while the enemy used the low visibility to close the distance. Her family back home, her career, and her pride, none of it mattered anymore as she huddled in the dirt, her rifle clicking empty. "Solace, see them anymore. I'm out of ammo," she sobbed, a raw sound of despair that broke through Caden's professional facade. It was the first time he had heard her use his name without a sneer, and the shift in her voice sent a jolt of protective iron through his soul.
In Nevada, the air conditioning hummed mockingly, a reminder of the thousands of miles of safety that separated them, a distance Caden now cursed with every fiber of his being. He pushed his headset closer to his ears, trying to filter out the roar of the storm on her end, to hear the slightest movement of the insurgents. "I can see them, Elena. I have the infrared overlay. They're 10 meters to your north, crawling behind the burnt-out transport," he guided her, his voice a tether of reality in her chaos. He saw her hand reach for a combat knife, her fingers shaking, and he felt an overwhelming urge to reach through the screen and pull her into the safety of his dark, quiet pod. The social pressure within the command center began to mount as Caden's flight commander tapped him on the shoulder, pointing at the fuel gauge and the deteriorating weather. "Solace, the drone is at the fail-safe limit. If you don't RTB now, we lose the bird in the storm. Disconnect and prep for the next shift," the officer ordered. Caden didn't even look back. his eyes fixed on the flickering image of Elena trying to sharpen her resolve against the inevitable. "She's still alive, sir. I'm not leaving her," he replied, his voice flat and immovable, a tone that startled his superior. On the ground, Elena felt a strange sensation of warmth as Caden's calm, steady instructions flowed into her earpiece, a stark contrast to the screaming wind and the approaching boots. She realized that the gamer she had mocked was the only person in the world who truly knew where she was, the only one witnessing her final moments. Her heart began to shift, the icy walls of her contempt melting under the heat of his unwavering presence. He wasn't just a technician, he was a lifeline, a man who refused to blink even as her own world went dark. "Why are you still talking to me?" she whispered into the mic, her voice trembling. "They told you to leave, didn't they?" Caden watched a group of hostiles crest the ridge above her, their weapons leveled at the crevasse where she lay hidden. "They told me a lot of things, Elena, but they don't know you like I do right now," he replied, his hand tightening on the joystick until his knuckles turned white. He saw her look up toward the sky again, not with the glare of a commander, but with the longing of a woman who had finally found someone worth coming home to. The distance between Nevada and the desert felt like it was collapsing, the digital connection turning into something far more visceral and dangerous. The enemy began to spray fire into the crevasse, the sparks of the bullets hitting the rock visible even through the sand-clogged sensors of the drone. Elena let out a sharp cry as a piece of shrapnel grazed her shoulder, her thermal signature flaring with the heat of fresh blood. Kadam's screen blurred as his own eyes welled with frustrated tears, the helplessness of his position finally breaking through his disciplined shell. He knew the drone wouldn't survive the flight back if he stayed another 5 minutes, but he also knew that 5 minutes was all the time Elena had left on this earth. "Stay small, Elena. I'm going to make a hole for you," Caden promised, his voice cracking with a sudden, desperate intensity that made her heart skip a beat. He began to override the drone's safety protocols, ignoring the blaring alarms on his console that warned of engine flameout. He saw her huddle into a ball, clutching the radio as if it were his very hand, her trust in him absolute in the face of death. He was about to commit career suicide to save a woman who had called him a coward, and as he looked at her one last time, he knew it was the easiest decision he had ever made. The sirens inside the Nevada control pod were a rhythmic, deafening scream of red lights and failing systems. Caden's flight commander was no longer just tapping his shoulder. He was shouting, his face inches from Caden's, demanding that he sever the link before the multi-million-dollar aircraft plummeted into the sand. "That's a direct order, Solace. Release the controls and let the bird go down in a neutral zone." But Caden's ears were filled only with the sound of Elena's ragged breathing 3,000 miles away. He reached out and physically locked the door to his station, his eyes fixed on the screen, where the enemy was prepping a final, coordinated rush on Elena's position. To the military, he was protecting a piece of property. To Caden, he was protecting the only thing that mattered in a world made of binary code. On the ground, Elena was surrounded by the smell of ozone and the metallic tang of blood, the sandstorm turning the world into a beige nightmare of shadows. She felt the vibration of the drone's low-altitude pass overhead, a sound so close it rattled the remaining plates of her tactical vest. She knew the bird shouldn't be that low, and she knew what it meant. Solace was burning through his fuel and his career to stay with her. A sudden, fierce clarity washed over her, a realization that this man, whom she had labeled a coward, was showing a brand of courage she had never encountered in the field. He wasn't just watching, he was suffering with her, fighting a battle against his own side to keep her breathing. "Elena, listen to me." Caden's voice came through, strained but incredibly focused, cutting through the static of her dying radio. I'm out of missiles, and the fuel line is failing. I have one move left to break their line and clear you a path to the LZ. Elena gripped her empty rifle, her eyes stinging with tears as she looked up at the flickering lights of the drone through the dust. She knew what he was implying, a kinetic strike, using the airframe itself as a weapon. The weight of his sacrifice hit her like a physical blow. He was throwing away his life's work, his freedom, and his reputation for a woman who had treated him like dirt.
"Don't you dare!" she choked out, her voice thick with emotion, as she saw the enemy signatures rise for the final assault. "Kaidan, if you do this, they'll break you. They'll put you in a cage for destroying that bird." She used his first name with a tenderness that felt like a vow, a bridge built in the middle of a war zone. But Kaidan just smiled a sad, invisible smile in the darkness of his pod, his fingers gripping the joystick for the final maneuver. "Then make it worth it, Elena. Get home so I have someone to wait for at the gates." In a moment of raw, unadulterated desperation, Elena screamed into the microphone, her words a frantic mixture of a command and a prayer. "Clear my path to the LZ, and I'll marry you when I get home. Don't you dare disconnect, Kaidan. Do you hear me? Don't leave me alone out here." The extreme challenge hung in the air, a promise born from the brink of death that changed the stakes from a rescue mission to a fight for a future. In Nevada, Kaidan's heart skipped a beat, the words fueling a surge of adrenaline that cleared the fog of exhaustion from his mind. Kaidan initiated the terminal dive sequence, overriding the drone's internal flight computer and pitching the nose down into a vertical scream toward the canyon floor. He targeted the largest cluster of enemy combatants, the thermal signatures of the hostiles scattering in panic as the massive Reaper drone grew larger in their sights. In the pod, the screens began to flicker and tear, the data packets struggling to keep up with the violent descent. Heian held the course steady, his eyes locked on the path he was carving through the enemy line, his mouth set in a grim line of absolute resolve. The impact was a silent whiteout on Kaidan's screen, a sudden burst of static that signaled the end of the drone and the beginning of his legal nightmare. On the ground, the explosion was a localized earthquake, a wall of fire and debris that swept through the enemy ranks, leaving a clear, smoking path toward the extraction point. Elena watched the fireball rise, the heat warming her face, as she realized the path was open. She scrambled to her feet, her body aching and her vision blurred, but she moved with a purpose she had never felt before, fueled by the silence now echoing in her ear. As the dust settled, the radio in Elena's ear emitted nothing but a soft, rhythmic hiss, the sound of a disconnected soul. She began to run, her boots hitting the sand in a desperate rhythm, pushing toward the sound of the approaching rescue helicopters. In Nevada, Kaidan sat in the sudden, oppressive silence of his darkened pod, his hands still trembling on the controls. The door to his station was being pounded on by military police, the sound of his impending arrest echoing the heartbeat of the woman he had just saved. He had cleared her path, but in doing so, he had walked himself directly into a cell. The heavy steel door of the military courtroom creaked open, marking the end of a grueling 6-month trial that had stripped Kaidan Solis of everything but his skin. He stood before the high bench, his uniform stripped of its patches, his silver wings now a haunting memory on a pile of confiscated property. The judge's voice was a cold, rhythmic drone as he read the verdict. Guilty of willful destruction of military property and disobedience of a direct lawful order. Kaidan felt the weight of the social pressure in the room, the glares from high-ranking officers who saw only the lost millions and the broken chain of command. Yet, as he stood there, his back was straighter than it had ever been in his air-conditioned pod, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon beyond the courtroom windows. The sentence was harsh, a dishonorable discharge and a period of confinement in a federal military prison, a final attempt to bury the gamer who had dared to act like a hero. As Kaidan was led away in handcuffs, he saw the faces of the men he had served with, their expressions a mix of pity. He felt a strange sense of peace. In the darkness,
He could still hear the sound of Elena's breathing and the crackle of the radio, a connection that the law could not sever. He was no longer a ghost in the machine. He was a man who had chosen a life over a joystick, and that was a victory no court could take away.
Outside the prison walls, the story of the Guardian of the Canyon began to circulate through the ranks, a whisper of defiance that turned the disgraced pilot into a living legend. Elena Thorne had spent those 6 months fighting a different kind of war, navigating the bureaucratic minefield of the Pentagon to tell the truth about what happened in that valley. She had been greeted as a hero upon her return, but she refused the medals and the promotions, spending every waking moment at the gates of the JAG headquarters. She remembered the calm voice in her ear when the world was ending, and the promise she had made in a moment of desperate clarity. To her, the man in the cell wasn't a criminal. He was the only man she had ever met who truly understood the meaning of no man left behind.
The environment of the military prison was a world of gray concrete and scheduled silence, a stark contrast to the high-stakes adrenaline of his former life. Caden spent his days in the yard, looking up at the sky, watching the real birds fly over the fence, and wondering if she was still out there. He didn't expect her to keep a promise made in the shadow of death. He knew how war could make people say things they didn't mean. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the thermal image of her looking up toward his drone, a digital gaze that had pierced through his soul. He held on to that image like a lifeline, a bit of static-filled hope that kept the cold of the prison stone from seeping into his heart.
On the day of his release, Caden walked through the final security checkpoint with nothing but a small bag of personal belongings and a set of civilian clothes that felt too loose. The sun was blinding as he stepped out of the heavy iron gates of Fort Leavenworth, the air smelling of fresh grass and freedom. He expected to find a lonely bus stop and a long road ahead of him, a man with a dishonorable label branded onto his future. He kept his head down, his gait hesitant, feeling the sudden vulnerability of being a man without a mission or a uniform. The world felt too big and too loud after the cramped silence of his cell and the digital narrowness of his cockpit.
A sharp, familiar whistle cut through the morning air, causing Caden to stop in his tracks and lift his head. Standing by a black SUV parked directly across the gate was Elena, her civilian clothes unable to hide the rigid, commanding posture of a field officer. She looked different, older, with a thin scar running along her jawline, but her eyes held the same fierce intensity that had once intimidated him in the briefing room. She didn't move toward him at first. She simply watched him, her expression a complex map of relief, guilt, and something much softer. Caden felt his throat tighten, the thousands of miles and months of separation vanishing in a single heartbeat as their eyes finally met in the real world.
Elena walked toward him, her boots clicking on the asphalt in a rhythm he had memorized through a headset months ago. She stopped inches from him, her hand reaching out to touch the space where his pilot wings used to be, her fingers trembling slightly. "You cleared the path, Caden," she whispered, her voice no longer a rasp of command, but a soft, steady vow. "I told you I'd be here when you got home, and I don't break my word to my air cover." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring, holding it between them like a peace treaty after a lifetime of war. Caden looked at the ring, then back at the woman who had once called him a coward, realizing that their connection across the distance had forged something stronger than any military bond. He took the ring, his hand closing over hers, the warmth of her skin finally replacing the cold plastic of the joystick. The insulters were silent. The court-martial was a ghost of the past, and the gamer had finally found a world where he was more than just a pixel on a screen. As they walked toward the car together, leaving the prison gates behind, Caden knew that while he had lost his wings, he had finally learned how to fly.